Hello and welcome to The Final, a new podcast on Fussball Geekz, all about famous Champions League finals. And what better place to start than in 1992-1993. A great and interesting season in the first ever season to find some Champions League branding in the competition, despite the fact that the group stage had come in a season before. And obviously, even though I kind of wrote a book on this, me, Rob Fletcher, that is, I'm not going to be sitting here on my own, navel-gazing, chatting through all the chapters that I wrote in my book about the Champions League. I've decided to obviously bring in Phil Harrison, who is chief and leader of the Fussball Geekz clan. Hi, Phil.
Good evening. Thanks for doing it, Rob. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, mate. I think it's going to be a good one. Alex, I was looking for Manchester United in this, but I couldn't quite find them. But we've still got you on anyway. I'm sure you can offer some expert insight as always. How are we doing, Alex?
Good, thank you. Yeah, we've just given another team a chance. We had a bit of a monopoly on it in the mid-90s.
Yeah, that's true. Anyone who had access to ITV knows that there was only one team in the Champions League from England in that decade, and that was Manchester United. So let's get into it. We're going to sort of talk through some of the teams that were featured, maybe some of those famous names that had been around in the 80s, the 70s, that had big reputations from the Eastern Bloc, for example. We're going to look at some of the passage of the finalists, how they got there, how they ended up getting through the groups. But before we get into all that sort of big stuff about the two finalists, AC Milan and Marseille, we're going to go right back to those preliminary rounds, those early knockout rounds. And Phil, were there any sort of teams, stories, players from that part of the competition that you thought really kind of caught your eye, either at the time or when you were looking back and doing a bit of research?
Well, there were, mate. Obviously, it was the first year of the Champions League, so there was a lot of new countries that had been kind of absorbed into that kind of that competition for the very first time. Countries from the Ukraine, it was their first year there. Latvia, Slovenia, Estonia, and Israel. So it was the first time Israel had ever had the Champions League team. But moving into the kind of prelim rounds, we talked about the English club that were in the competition. In the first round, it was Leeds, and they endured a tough draw. They were drawn against the German champions Stuttgart, and they went to Stuttgart, and in the first half, if I remember, they played really well, and they looked as if they could have been like one or two ahead, and then all of a sudden they get banged by 2 goals in about 4 minutes, both by Fritz Walter, obviously bearing the name of the old kind of German forward Fritz Walter as well. He scored 2, and then they added another one late on. So Leeds 3-0 down after the first leg, and you look at that and you think they're out. So it went to the second game at Ellen Road, took an early lead, but then conceded a soft away goal, but eventually won 4-1 on the night. But of course, that wasn't enough to take them through because it was away goals. But Stuttgart got done because they put on an illegitimate substitution. And
Sounds crazy, doesn't it, Phil, to think that even that, I mean, they couldn't even get the right number of players. It was an additional foreign player that they put on the pitch, wasn't it, I think, at the time?
That's it. I think it was an Icelander that they brought on with about 8 minutes left. And they saw the tie, won 4-1. But then, of course, it went to UEFA, and they annulled the result and gave Leeds a 3-0 win, which, of course, necessitated a third game, a playoff in the Camp Nou in Barcelona. I think there was about 16,000 people in the Camp Nou, and it became quite an iconic game for one player who was from about 3 or 4 years previously been playing for Spalding United. But he scored the winner in the Nou Camp, and that was, of course, guys, we know the name. Or do we?
I wonder if the listeners, I mean, I know that I had to write a bit about that in the book. Do you know who it was, Alex?
I'm afraid I don't. Who was that?
Shall I reveal? It was Carl Schutt.
That was, just for the listeners out there, that was Schutt.
Yeah, Schutt with the U, guys. Yeah.
It's funny, Phil, isn't it, how UEFA decided that giving it as a 3-0 to Leeds then would mean another playoff game instead of just annulling the result completely, restarting and just playing that second leg. But I suppose UEFA at the time, well, even now, isn't it? They kind of struggle with their own rules sometimes, don't they?
They do. I think that's a good point. But also, when you've Leeds have ran it so close with that 4-1er, and there were 10 minutes to go, and they were pushing for that winner as well. So I suppose when it's that tight, you can't just ask them to play it again, because it puts them at a total disadvantage, when of course they should be benefiting from the indiscretions of their opponents. So anyway, Shutty's scored the winner with 13 minutes left, and Leeds are through to the next round. However, a lot of points of interest in the first round were also Barcelona, who were the reigning champions. They had an incredibly sticky passage through to the second round. Excuse the terminology there. They were up against the Norwegian champions, Viking of Stavanger, and they squeezed through by the tightest of margins. They won 1-0. So it was a Barcelona who, they graced the tournament the previous season, looked really good. And now they were struggling both domestically and in Europe.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting thing, Alex. I suppose we're probably quite conditioned into the current format of the Champions League, but it was quite an interesting thing to have, big, in inverted commas, teams in these early rounds facing off such minnows, when nowadays normally they're completely gone from the competition. I mean, obviously, TV money plays a big part in it. Do you think there's still a hankering for these kind of knockout rounds where sort of the little guy plays the big guy?
I think that's what we think of, don't we? And maybe that's with the idea of probably the medium scale teams that can cause an upset. We think of teams like Monaco, who were excellent, Villarreal, who've been very good. But you can see from some of these early results that when you have the really small nations that get filtered out, don't they, through the qualifying rounds, and they were in the first round, and there are a few sort of big results. Milan, we'll talk about throughout this. They beat Ljubljana 7-0. There was a 9-1 win for Porto, 8-0 for PSV. So yeah, it's kind of careful what you wish for, isn't it? Because it would be nice, and you see there's whole of Europe represented, but there are still those sporting disparities and financial disparities. It's very difficult to kind of get away from, and very clear in this qualifying round that they were there.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing, and I think sometimes giving these teams the opportunities to play against the big teams in bigger stadiums against quality opposition possibly didn't actually support the development of football in those countries, because they didn't necessarily sort of develop and push on. I think through the 90s there was some teams who had strong showings in the Champions League, like Rosenborg and Molde, like for sort of the back end of the 90s. But there were some interesting results in that first round. Like you say, you had a 4-1, a 7-0, a 8-0. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing some highlights of the Austria, Vienna, and Sofia, which was 5-4 in aggregate, because games like that, I mean, I do love those aggregate ties, and I think getting rid of the away goals rule, although it might mean that it's possibly more attacking football played in knockout stages, I think that rule in a competition like this at this time, I think, was quite a crucial part of it. And we move then into a smaller second round before a group stage. So the group stage was going to start in November. So we've got some quite interesting ties here. We've got CSKA Moscow against Barcelona, PSV, AEK Athens, got Marseille, Dinamo Bucharest. But the big one, Phil, was the Battle of Britain.
It was
a huge game, wasn't it? I mean, Rangers at that time were a really, really good side. They had money to invest, which we have to probably asterisk to say maybe the money wasn't there as time went on, and financial maybe problems arose with how they'd sign players and the way they'd put the money and all that sort of stuff. But at this point, they certainly, you could argue, were the strongest British representative in the competition, possibly even if a team like United, who, although lost the league to Leeds the season before, were as good as, if not possibly, a better side all round. But they were a strong team, weren't they, Rangers?
They were indeed. I think observing in hindsight that Rangers team of the early 90s, you're probably looking at the best Rangers team of all time, I don't want to kind of snub any kind of Rangers fans here, but certainly in my lifetime, the finest Rangers team, of their generation. But they had great players all over the pitch. Just Trevor Steven was in there, who was a kind of league championship winner with in England. And they had the front two of Mark Hateley, who recently returned from Italy, where he'd been, although not a categoric success there, the Italians certainly respected him, and the AC Milan fans still love him. So he was a very kind of he was deceptively mobile for a man of his height. But what he did do, he was great at holding the ball up, and obviously bringing in the other forward, who was Ali McCoist, who is probably, I'd say, one of the most underrated forwards ever. He was a great finisher. Great with his head for a man of like 5'8". He was over 10 yards. He was super quick, and he could ping in shots from outside the box as well. He was a very kind of multifaceted striker. So I think you're right, Rob, when you say that they were really kind of good side, and that was the tie of the second round. It was Rangers versus Leeds with the first leg at Ibrox. But it started very, very badly for Rangers, and within about 50 seconds, they were 1-0 behind. And it was Gary McAllister with the sweetest kind of left foot volley from outside the box right into the roof of the net. But Rangers recovered and eventually won 2-1. Lukic scoring a bit of an OG, and then McCoist rifling half chance in from just outside the 6-yard box. So they went into the second leg 2-1 up, but it was still the kind of belief that it was going to be Leeds who won on the night. But due to some great forward play by both Hateley and McCoist, and a truly virtuoso performance by Andy Gorham in the Rangers goal, they qualified, and it was Rangers who made it into that final 8. But it was a great game. The 2 goals that Rangers scored were fantastic. There's Hateley with this looping volley from outside the box, but the coup de grace was the breakaway second, where Hateley's kind of whipped in across to the far post with Leeds exposed, and McCoist, as it's not a power header, he just guides it back across the goal past the keeper who's already committed, and that was it. That was them safely booked into the 8-team Champions League,
and that was, like you said, that was an absolute elite strike force. I've had a look at some stats for those who hate Liam McCoist.
A lot of goals.
Ali McCoist scores 49 goals that season, and then Mark Hateley scores 29 goals that season. McCoist is in the midst of a back-to-back European Golden Shoe double, which I think these are the times before they had the multipliers in, didn't they, for the various leagues that were classed as not as strong. And obviously they played a lot more league games in Scotland. I think it was 44. But that Rangers side, they won 33 games out of 44 in the league that season, which is frightening. They also, just as an aside note, Aberdeen that season only conceded 1 more goal than Rangers and only scored 10 less. Like the quality of the top of that league at the time was probably a lot tighter than it is now. But yeah, I mean, a really brilliant team. And Alex, if you look down the list of some of the other games, I mean, obviously for us supporting teams in England, that Rangers versus Leeds game was massive. It's on TV. It kind of gets all the headlines. But if you actually look down the names of some of the other goal scorers in the other fixtures, I mean, Milan win the first game 1-0 from Maldini, but then this is the list of goal scorers. You can't help but smile when you read these out. You've got Boban scores, Frank Rijkaard, Simone, and Jean-Pierre Papin. Now, in the same sequence, Boxic scores a couple for Marseille. You've got Romario scores a hat-trick. Some of the names around that time, I think, for us, maybe, who like 90s football, and that was kind of our upbringing, there are some incredible names on those team sheets, aren't there?
Yeah, it's definitely a playground list, isn't it, of those you try to recreate. I think this was the first time that really these players were becoming much better known, weren't they, in the English league? Like, you didn't have that much exposure outside of World Cups, and the fact that ITV started to have the regular coverage, and you also had at the same time you had the Serie A coverage coming around. So suddenly you get a lot of this football kind of piped into your living room, which just hadn't been the case before. So you can get these attachments to players, and like you say, there were so many foreign stars against what was a relatively kind of parochial Premier League, wasn't it? There weren't many foreign players, so it really kind of lived up to the hype, this exotic Champions League with all these world stars.
Do you think that kind of contributes towards the Premier League's attitude to these types of players, Alex? Like, obviously at the time, like you said, there was not a lot of money to spend, we'll say, at the time. Obviously there's a TV deal was coming in. Do you think that exposure that fans got to these types of players starts to kind of open the league up and open maybe fans' eyes to something that's a little bit different, maybe? Because obviously a lot of criticism of the Premier League was it was just the same as what had gone before with a new name. But I suppose this Champions League element, the increased TV coverage and Serie A, kind of makes fans look at things differently as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the TV money makes a big difference, doesn't it? There's not a very generous TV deal. There's a lot of negotiation over it. Obviously, 1985 Heysel, the ban causes a lot of problems. First of all, with the TV money, that football becomes very undesirable. And then, of course, you're banned for 5 years. So you don't have access to that income. It just becomes very unpopular. And it's actually, football in England is helped by, like, 1990 World Cup, as we always say, is just finding its way back. And so when you have that extra TV income, you sort of starting to market it, aren't you, to a different group of people and get more of that merchandising income. Like, they've never really exploited that. And in the 90s, you start to, get sort of 20-page catalogs and stuff like that. So I think it's probably like the incomes facilitated it. You had massive billionaires involved with Milan and Marseille, as we'll talk about. Probably didn't have as much of that in football in the UK.
Just sticking on the point of TV, Phil, the sort of group stage, I'm not going to say it was necessitated from very rich men wanting their football clubs to be even richer, but you could argue that was probably a lot of what it was. The group stage is sort of guaranteed income for clubs because they'd get 6 games, 3 home, 3 away. They knew what they were signing up for. If they could just get out with that second round, get themselves into the group stage. Do you think, I'm not going to say, do you think this was the beginning of the end, but do you think this is kind of what really, truly shapes European football as we know it today?
I think it's. I'm going back to sort of like what the previous thing where you were saying about. I think what happened, it changed English fans' perceptions of how we were playing our game over here. So we saw that our style wasn't necessarily working. There was a lot of variety in style in the way that we played, but it tended to be very British football, and it opened our eyes to a different type of football. And I think maybe a symptom of that is the way that a lot of teams play today. But in regard to that's just the theory, obviously. But money chairman, I suspect this is the way that UEFA wanted football to go, because you had, Berlusconi, who was at Milan, and he was pumping money into their club, and also Bernard Tapie at Marseille, both, allegedly dubious characters who would do anything to ensure that their club made it into those group stages. I mean, at the tail end of this particular season, Marseille was stripped of their French league title. So they progressed through the group stage. They got to the final, but they then consequently, it's something we'll probably come back to, but consequently they couldn't defend their title, and it was all due to the malpractices of dubious money men behind the whole thing. But as you say, I think that's what UEFA wanted. They wanted an elite of teams who would be churning out similar type kind of games in this format year upon year upon year, and creating a kind of a European Super League. I know that was kind of thrown out years ago, but I don't think that's the end of it. I think we'll start to hear about that at some point in the future when it's being kind of absorbed into everyone's kind of acceptable boundaries once again.
In a way, you could argue this final is actually the perfect two teams to be in the first ever European Cup final with the Champions League branding, because we do have to say it wasn't called the UEFA Champions League at this point. I'm sure many people listening out there are well versed in the titles of these things and how things change, a bit like the Premier League and the Premiership to a certain extent. So it was only this group stage that was defined as the UEFA Champions League. It'll be later on, and we are going to work through these finals chronologically. So looking in a couple of years' time, when the full branding does take over, you can start to see how things are reshaped and changed. But at this point, we're still in the European Cup era. We decided on this one because there was a bit of a change in terms of the branding, and kind of the group stage had been here to stay. So Alex, we've got Milan and Marseille are our two focus teams there in the final. They are kind of the prototype Abramovich era Chelsea, Man City in this current era. Those teams that spent an awful lot of money building squads basically to rule football. Now, obviously, Tapia didn't spend as much money as Berlusconi, but these two really did that summer build massive squads with huge transfers. As a youngster at this time, maybe thinking about teams like Milan, who were some of those players that would sort of really stand out, maybe when you watched it on Gazzetta or reading your well-thumbed pages of world soccer at this time?
I suppose there's a few out there that Jean-Pierre Papin was kind of one of those that we'd always, he would be one of those playground heroes that you would try and emulate. And just the thing that sticks is that range of volleys, isn't it? I think that was the thing that was really distinctive about him. Obviously, Van Basten would definitely be right up there. Rudy Voller, Alan Boksic when he came along, so a lot of attacking players. I totally agree with you. I think the Marseille is maybe a prototype for Bayern in the sense that there was a lot of domestic talent got snapped up. But actually, when you look at Milan, there's quite a lot of players who you think like who came through, sort of Maldini, Albertini, Costa Curta, Baresi. There were quite a few homegrown talents, and there were a couple of really very high value additions, but it was much more stable, whereas Marseille was like that Abramovich era, will almost sign a new, half a new team each season. So it's kind of like old money, new money sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very much that way. Berlusconi, kept spending and spending and spending in the summer of '92, which has been written about at length by many people. And Phil, that Milan team and Berlusconi, he basically openly admitted that he wanted to build a super team. He wanted to win every competition that he was in. Obviously, they'd been banned from the European Cup the year before. They had huge success. What I love is, and this is maybe a bit sad, but if you just search for any team and write seasons after it, they're always got their full Wikipedia page with like the whole history of the club. And if you look at Milan from, 87 to 96 kind of thing, the amount of European trophies they'd won, European Cups, Intercontinental Cups, European Super Cups, obviously later on win the Champions League. Berlusconi built a huge squad. One of the interesting things, I think, was they had double the number of foreign players they were actually allowed. And they kind of sort of made Capello build sort of a squad rotation system, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Those stars were real stars on the continent as well before they'd come to Milan. You've got the likes of Boban, Savicevic, and Papin, who joined all that summer. Did you have any favourites from that era, Phil, from that great side?
Definitely, Savicevic for me was the player. He was like the metronome. He was in the kind of like sort of centre right of that midfield, but everything sort of went through him. And I just loved him as a player. His poise, his skill, his passing range, and his ability to kind of find little pockets in the box and do fantastic things. So as a foreign player, he's my favourite. Obviously, there's Boban as well, who added even more kind of quality to that midfield. But the player that I absolutely loved was one of their own. He was one of their stable players. That was Roberto Donadoni. He was a player. He had so many tricks. It was just like he'd be working that line and somehow produce some magic that would take him past players. And for me, he was one player, maybe not overrated, but not as profile as the other players in the team. But he was immense. But also up front as well, Marco Simone. He was a thoroughly kind of efficient goal scorer who could hit the ball with both feet. He was super fast. So they had innumerate gifts. You know what I mean? And it's like you say, they did get into this kind of rota system where they'd have to play different players. But I think as time elapsed, it would be Savicevic and Boban who would be in that team. And the expensive additions like Papan will be on the bench and only play bit parts because Savicevic and Boban were so integral and so vital to that Milan side.
Yeah, and I think things fluctuated quite a lot. If you look at the sort of player stats for the season, Papan only starts 22 games. Van Basten only starts 14 games that season, scores 13 goals. I mean, I know he was a phenomenal striker and he scored a phenomenal amount of goals, but he only actually plays 22, makes 22 appearances in total in that whole season. He scores 20. I mean, we talk probably the modern era version is probably the Brazilian Ronaldo in terms of kind of lots of success. And Van Basten, don't get me wrong, scored a ton of goals and won a load of trophies. But obviously his career was criminally shortened by injury and bad luck as well. Like genuine bad luck. I think Van Basten got a lot of the time. A lot of his injuries that he had possibly wouldn't be as debilitating now as they were then, maybe sort of 30 years ago. But what really randomly, I don't know why, Daniele Massaro was always a player that I kind of never really understood because I'd only ever seen, brief bits of football and whatever. Because he kind of felt like he was a bit of a winger, but then sometimes he'd play up front and kind of always used to be in the right place. But he was sort of one of those players who you'd never really heard that much about in the league. You'd seen the Ruud Gullit on the pages of Shoot, you know what I mean? Or Rijkaard or Van Basten or even like Papan, people like that. But he was someone who you never really saw. Albertini, I think, was someone I grew to appreciate over time. But if we start thinking about the final, I suppose, and the sort of path to the final, Milan, I mean, they were in absolutely incredible form as they went through. And I think everybody probably thought they were the ones to take it. Alex, in their first ever Champions League game that they played against IFK Gothenburg, Van Basten scores 4 goals in the first game. And I suppose it probably is sort of peak era 92 that Van Basten in his red and black stripes bags those 4 goals. But he was an incredible striker, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've said, just horribly waylaid by injury. And I think the final we're going to talk about was pretty much his last serious game at 28. So a real loss. And you can only think what he could have done with another 4, 5, 6 years of his career, especially when you see the Ajax, the 95 team coming in, that, he could have been the wise old head, the kind of Harry Kane leading that group and perhaps sort of pulling them together a bit better than Patrick Kluivert did. But yeah, Milan, really invincible in that group stage, conceding 1 goal against, some pretty decent sides, PSV, Porto, IFK, Gothenburg side that would be a large part kind of backbone for the good squad in the Sweden squad in '94 World Cup. So, not like mug teams. There was a very efficient way of filtering the teams down to some really high quality teams, and then to have done so well against such opposition, they just strolled to the final, didn't they? Really?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I love that the only person that scored against him was Romario. That kind of feels like just such a Romario thing to do. It's kind of like, don't worry, lads, I've got this one. It's going to be me. Marseille, on the other hand, Phil, I mean, they were a great team. They had a really, really good squad. That season, they had a great team. people like Fabien Barthez, Jocelyn Anglemar, Deschamps, Frank Sorzy, Boksic, Voller, Abida Pele. But they didn't have it all their own way in that group stage, did they? It was a pretty tight one right up until the end, wasn't it?
It was, mate. Yeah, I mean, the first thing, the big omission was that Barcelona didn't make it into the group stage. No, they were knocked out by CSKA Moscow after a 1-1 draw in Moscow. Barcelona were 2-0 up and coasting in the Camp Nou, and CSK scored a goal just before half time, and then the kind of valuable away goal, and then snatched the late winner. So they went through. So they were a bit of a kind of, they were expected to produce more in the group, but of course, obviously, with a kind of disintegration of the Soviet Union, they were kind of hobbled by the fact that they had to play all of their home games in different countries around well, I think it was all three of them that had to play in Germany. So they didn't have the kind of the home crowd behind them for that stage. So yeah, Marseille were the premier team in that group, but then also you had as we've discussed earlier, a pretty dangerous and decent Rangers team coming through. And I actually remember the first game of that group stage. They played Rangers at Ibrox, and for 60 minutes, Marseille battered them, absolutely battered them, and they were 2-0 up. But then Rangers started to find something and discovered some of the potency that they obviously showed in the league. And there was an 18-yard header by Gary McSwegan that put them back into the game. It's from outside, on the edge of the box, if not just outside. And this header from out the blue puts Rangers back into it. And then there's a kind of well of enthusiasm from the crowd, which enables them to sneak an equaliser through Mark Haitley late on. So it kind of set the tone for the group, and it was a very much a kind of nip and tuck chase all the way through the group. Marseille were winning games more impressively than Rangers were, but Rangers were eking out results via ability and quite a large degree of luck as well. Two of their winners in the two games they won in the group, they drew all the other four. The two winners, if you look at them, they were incredibly fluky. There was a shot that kind of looped off a defender's knee against CSK away that sort of like just fell in under the bar, and then there was a ball played from outside the box which hit the turf against Bruges at home, and just that looped over the keeper as well. So taking nothing away from Rangers, they were a good side, but they had a lot of fortune that kept them in the hunt right until the last game. But it was Marseille that sneaked it at the end. They went through, but a great effort by Rangers too.
Yeah, I mean, I think all Rangers fans that you speak to, and I know I've spoken to people in terms of when I was writing the book, are just sort of cursed that last round of fixtures where they were so close to a European Cup final, which, you know, you could probably argue with the performance that they put in along the way, they probably deserved their chance to get there against two massive sides with huge budgets. I mean, even though, let's not kid ourselves, Rangers had invested money in that playing squad, and they'd invested it wisely, and they'd built a good squad, certainly not to the levels of Marseille and Milan. But I do think they'll probably continue to rue the day that they didn't get into that final, because obviously you kind of feel like sometimes these teams, it's like sliding doors moments, isn't it? And once that moment passes, that might be it. You know, you may never be sort of coming back to that arena again. And I think Marseille certainly had that feeling about them, about this season, because obviously they've been to a European Cup final before. They tried to sort of build from there. They'd lost, obviously, to Red Star, wasn't it, in 91, I think? And then they got to this point. Now, Alex, the managerial situation at Marseille at that point was a bit of an interesting one, because they had a very aged manager, and Milan themselves had come through the Sacchi era, who'd kind of reinvented Italian football away from sort of the Catenaccio and was into pressing and 4-4-2 and compact. And I'm just going to pause there because I started to watch some of Arrigo Sacchi's football again recently, and it's like you can throw a sheet over all their players. it was so compact and so aggressive, and that football style was quite interesting. But his lieutenant was left in charge, Fabio Capello, who was a bit of a company man, wasn't he? And it was quite interesting, that sort of contrast between the two managers, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, the idea was that Capello was this kind of company stooge who'd been kind of brought in there, which seemed laughable when you think of his record over the last 25 years or so. But yeah, continued largely with Sacchi's kind of style of play, brought in a couple of new players, as we've said, maybe a bit more attacking and whatever, but not somebody that rocked the boat. But yeah, a young coach, his first kind of large club assignment, and then in the opposite dugout you've got Raymond Goethals, who is exactly the opposite. So he's, really kind of a journeyman's probably the wrong word, because he's brought success at a lot of places, but he's experienced lots of different leagues. So probably first pops up when he's leading the Belgium side to 1972 Euro semis, wins the Cup Winners' Cup with Anderlecht in the late 70s, and also gets them to a final. He then goes to Brazil. He gets Sao Paulo to the point of runners-up in their Serie A championship. And, success again then back in the Belgian game and in France and so on. So somebody at that point who's really, really knows the ropes, knows continental football, international football inside out, coming up against somebody who's very much in the early stages of his career, sort of a proto, Andre Villas-Boas sort of character. So yeah, two's kind of attacking two different philosophies or career stages.
Yeah, and it's crazy when you look at his first managerial job was in 1957, which when you think about 90s football, you don't think about people who were managing a huge amount of time before. I mean, you probably just take it for granted. It's probably like a Roy Hodgson type, Neil Warnock situation, is it? Because I know he'd taken over the year before during the season. But these two men got their teams together. They got through to the final. The final was held in Munich, and they put their teams out. So I'm just going to go through the starting 11s, because I think it's great to hear some of these names. And you can't always trust how teams look on paper, how they're set out. But I think Marseille definitely set out to stifle Milan and stop them playing. So the Milan side, Rossi, Tassotti, Baresi, Costa Curta and Maldini. And Baresi was that kind of stopper come sweeper who was deceptively quick despite looking age 45 for the majority of his career. That was that sort of really famous backline. Then Donadoni, Rijkaard, Albertini and Lentini, which you could argue was probably quite a traditional midfield at the time. Donadoni and Lentini were wingers. Donadoni maybe more of a right midfielder than an out-and-out winger. Lentini was certainly a dribbler who liked to get forward. Then you've got Van Basten and Massaro. No place for Papan next to Van Basten. Then for Marseille, you had Fabien Barthez with hair. Yes, that did exist, listeners. Fabien Barthez did at one point have hair, and he was still a fantastic goalkeeper at that point, and he actually plays quite a big role in the final for Marseille. Then you've got Dimeco, Desai, Boli, Anglamar, and Ideally across the back, and then you got Deschamps and Frank Sorzi midfield. Then you've got Rudi Voller, Alan Boksic, and Abide Pele as sort of the main attackers, and it was quite a fluid system, in the sense that a lot of it was to stop Milan. Phil, Marseille clearly had a plan. And they really executed it, especially in that first half. Although they gave up some chances, they'd executed it really well, didn't they?
They did. I mean, it was like a four-man defence with like the two screening players as well. So and they had a sweeper. So it was like you said, Milan were compact and you could throw a sheet over them. That was kind of the way that Marseille set up against Milan in that final. I mean, another interesting thing about that final was that the referee, it was Kurt Roethlisberger, a Swiss official. And we talk about how dubiously moneyed Marseille and AC Milan were. Well, this guy, a year later, he was involved in a huge bribe scandal with Manchester United, because the Galatasaray Man U game, there was talk of bribery about there, with Cantona alleging afterwards that guy's been bought. and it was kind of spoken about in the kind of the back rooms of UEFA. But then by 96, 97, he was completely banned because he tried to broker a ref for a Grasshoppers of Zurich game in Europe. So we, in essence, you said had the perfect final money wise with the what the Champions League became. We also had kind of a dubious ref in the game as well. But going back to the game, yeah, there was a plan by Marseille to completely nullify Milan's weapons. And after the first 10-15 minutes, when Milan had two good chances, and like you say, Barthez was a fabulous keeper. He pulled off two tremendous saves early doors. Milan started didn't quite have the fluidity that they started with in that game thereon.
Yeah, and I think that Milan definitely went out to attack, and I think that Marseille matched them. I really think they did. It's almost like the number that some of the other teams in the 80s had done against some of these bigger nations. You like to Steaua Bucharest against Barcelona in 86. Red Star completely changed the way they played, didn't they, in 91? Because they were a cavalier, incredible offensive force that decided they just wanted to win. They found that being more defensive was that way out. But Alex, that Milan side really did pepper that Marseille goal, but despite all that attacking quality, they found it difficult and challenging to break them down. There's some great names in that Milan side, but were you surprised, maybe watching it back, that they really struggled to find the net, especially in this one?
It's the irresistible force and the immovable objects.
Yeah.
Hackneyed old cliche. But this is the whole point of it, isn't it? The Champions League. It's the competition of the best players, and you look at Basile Boli, Marcel Desailly, two of the finest defenders. You think Jocelyn Anglemar, who would even a decade hence in his sort of mid to late 30s would be barreling down the line for Valencia. So there's real strength in depth. Deschamps be running a Champions League winning midfield for Juventus not far after this. So you've got a fantastic defensive and attacking force of Milan, but also it's probably not surprising that you've got a great side with a very experienced coach that are able to go into them. Interestingly, I was listening to an interview with Basile Boli, and he said he had a groin injury quite early on, and he was sort of nursing himself through the game. You think of all these, to be facing the likes of Van Basten and Donadoni, etc., with half a groin is some doing.
I think that image of Basile Boli with half a groin, I think, is just gonna linger in the air for a moment there. Sorry, Phil.
But there's an interesting point there, because prior to the game, apparently, Bernard Tapie had put on the blackboard in the Marseille dressing room. He'd just written the words "injections for everyone." So we talk about teams wanting to win, moneyed people in charge, dodgy referees, and the possibility of universal drug use throughout the team. So yeah, that's the Champions League era for you, mate.
It's like the UEFA Christmas party, isn't it? I think it's kind of indicative of everything that was going on around such a game like this. There would just be a single goal, Phil, that actually decided the game. And a single goal, not from Alan Boksic or Rudy Voller or Marco van Basten, but big Basile Boli from a set piece as well. Good old-fashioned, get in the mixer, get your big nut on it, and give us a goal. But it's actually a brilliant goal, isn't it, really? Like, when you look at it, it's a great header and a great goal.
It is just the sheer kind of brevity of the goal, for all the fantastic, incredible talent on the pitch. It's a set piece winner that wins it, and that, even in today's modern football, a lot of those goals come from that kind of thing. But it's a delivery on the cross, isn't it? All he needs to do is get a brush on it, and there it is. But my not problem with it, but the issue that I see about that goal is it breaks every kind of defending rule that you were taught as a young kid, which is stick a man on the post. There was no one on that far post, and if there had been, destiny might have changed in that game. But maybe Milan would have got those players firing in the second half. It's all ifs and maybes, isn't it? But it wasn't a great game, but Marseille found a way to win after the disappointment of Red Star in Barry.
I will say, with my commitment to this podcast, I did rewatch the whole of the Champions League final for 92-93. If you are listening to this podcast, there is a 10-minute version of the highlights, which I would highly recommend over the 90-minute version of the game, because I mean, it's one of those things where I can't remember what game it was in the Premier League recently and this season now, and kind of it was one of those tactical battles, as we like to call it. Other people call it boring, but you could argue that something like this didn't actually produce the sort of style that they wanted to see from this bright, shiny Champions League product. And Alex, no matter what the money makers and the deal makers and the men behind the scenes, you can't manufacture entertainment in football, can you? It's that, and I suppose that's probably why we love it, isn't it? Especially finals, because it's that air of tension, that sort of idea of people not wanting to make mistakes that probably actually makes it more watchable, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many finals that you don't remember the quality of the football, but as you say, the tension, even as a neutral, is ratcheted right up for the Champions League, even though you're not a vested party in it necessarily. Just so much at stake that every slip, every half chance at goal becomes kind of really important, and especially kind of these are two really high pressure chairmen as well, aren't they? That they've got one aim, and one single slip really derails what you're kind of trying to build as well.
And I think Bernard Tapie did a pretty good job of that, didn't he, Phil? Of derailing the Marseille machine. We alluded to a little bit before about the match fixing scandal, but they'd paid off another team to effectively go easy on them before in the run up to the Champions League final, wasn't it? To get the league won and out of the way. Thinking about legacy after this final for a team like Marseille, it had huge ramifications for the club, both from a punitive point of view, but also from a legacy point of view, didn't it?
It did, mate. Obviously, it was a title that they couldn't defend because they were thrown out of the competition. They were only allowed to keep their crown because they hadn't used kind of bribed referees in their European games, but they were also relegated. So so you've got first of all, you got Rudy Voller and you've got Alan Boxic up front. You got Marcel Desailly in the centre of your midfield, and the next season you got Tony Cascarino up front. so yeah, that was the immediate legacy of Marseille. No European football for the next few seasons, and Tony Cascarino as your centre forward. Complete change in direction there, mate. Yeah,
it's really crazy, isn't it? Because they were allowed to carry on in the league the following season, which I just find is crazy. And obviously they carried on and they played it, and they actually finished second to Paris Saint-Germain, so didn't actually win the league. Qualified for the UEFA Cup and got relegated. I mean, it really was a crazy story, and I think it's a real shame that first, Champions League branded final, you're going to remember Marseille probably more for the scandals that followed, which maybe is in keeping with why football is forever entertaining as a sport, and there's always controversy knocking around. But from a Milan point of view, Alex, obviously 92-93 was a great season for them. They got to the final, albeit not successful, but they won the league again. The following season's an interesting one. This is a good one to look at. They scored 36 goals in the following season and only conceded 15. Now, we talked a little bit about their sort of potent attack when they had Van Basten in there and their incredible defence, but it's kind of taking it to a little bit of a new level, isn't it, that one, I think?
I think when you're shorn of Van Basten, that's a big source of goals gone, isn't it? But yeah, it's a change that Capello became. I think he'd been quite progressive in his first season, and you'd had a decent outgoing attacking side, and then maybe feeling the hot breath of Berlusconi on his neck, he was thinking, well, I've got to really be sure of this. But it's a remarkable record, isn't it? And I can't see anything like that happening again in any time soon. It's really incredible, and still, so many talented attackers that have somehow been nullified by his coaching. It wasn't like a lack of potency, as you say, from the players that we've talked about in the final. You've got creative people like Boban. You've also got Laudrup, Carboni, Radicucci, people like that. But yet it's sort of almost all to naught, that they don't combine to great effect.
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? I mean, spoiler alert for the past, we will be talking about AC Milan once more on the next edition of the final. So we'll go into a little bit more about that, because there's some very interesting comparisons to be made with their league season and their actual Champions League form, which we'll get onto a little bit later in the next edition. This is one I've not actually prepped you for, gents. So I'm going to ask you a little question now.
Ooh.
Do you think, Phil and Alex, do you think if this match was played again in 92-93, do you think we would have the same victor? Phil, do you think we'd have the same victor? And if not, why do you think the result might have been a bit different?
Well, I just think that both sides went about and tried and played quite conservatively. I mean, the value of hindsight is that you know what the result is going to be. So I think Milan would have played it completely different. Maybe played three up front. Maybe left Lentini out because he didn't have a great game. And by the end of the season, his career was virtually over anyway, because he was injured in a car crash, wasn't he? So he was gone. I think play Papana as your central striker, get Donadoni and Simone around him, and try and force a different outcome up front. I think Milan would have won had it been played again.
What about you, Alex?
I think maybe a slightly more subtle version of that. It was always going to be Phil talked about the really cautious setup, particularly from Marseille. It was never going to be a high scoring final. I think if you played it 100 times, maybe Milan would have won 60 or 70 or so. So definitely had the edge, but probably wasn't clear cut. It was going to be one of those things that probably a scrappy goal, unless Van Basten got some thunder volley. It was going to be that kind of game.
Yeah, and I think it definitely played out that way, and probably would have carried on playing out the way, considering how Marseille had set up. So we start the final with the 92-93 season. Marseille 1-0 victors over AC Milan. Next up, we have the 93-94 season, and my first ever Champions League final that I watched live was AC Milan versus Barcelona. And that's what we've got coming next time. Phil and Alex, thanks a lot for chatting through this very first Champions League season and looking at the final. Phil, who would have been your favourite player from the 92-93 Champions League season? I
would say, for me, it's always been about Roberto Donadoni on his day. He was probably my favourite player of that era anyway. So he didn't have a great game on the day, but he was a great player. Alex, who are you picking?
I think this is the last chance we get to pick Marco Van Basten, so I'm not going to pass up that opportunity.
Excellent. Well, thank you for both joining me in chatting through this, and thank you to everyone who's listened, followed along. Check out those highlights online. There's loads of great writing as well about this final. So thank you very much from us here at the final on Fussball Geekz. Please do remember to do all that like, share, rate, and review stuff, because that's how we know that you're enjoying it and that you're listening, and we hopefully will hear from us again next time.
Bye all.